So I run the Sustainable Energy Initiative here at George Washington University Law School, and we have had the great honor of working with C2ES on a number of projects over the last couple of years, and I'm happy to welcome them back for, I think, the third time to hosting one of their solutions forums here at the law school. Just a few housekeeping matters. Emergency exit over here, obviously the way you came in. There are restrooms, a ladies' room here, gender neutral restroom there, and more restrooms down the hall. I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. And I'm at this point going to turn it over to a man who needs no introduction, but I nevertheless have been told I could introduce him. Bob Perciasepe, president of C2ES, former deputy administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Certainly he has brought leadership to this group that is just remarkable and has helped us shape the way we can approach and think about some of these very difficult issues. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Bob and C2ES to George Washington University Law School. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Donna. It's great to be here again. I love being in a courtroom. No, I don't. It reminds me too much of a congressional hearing. Well, we're really excited today because we're releasing a new report that focuses on solutions for maintaining the existing nuclear fleet in the United States. And we're going to hear today why this is important. It's important for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, we come at it from the climate change and pollution perspective, but there are many other reasons that are very important, from national security to economic development, that are going to come, that will be discussed during the course of the day. But to get us started today, it's my pleasure to introduce Ralph Izzo, who's the chairman and president and CEO of PSEG, which is Public Service Enterprise Group, largest electric utility in the state of New Jersey. And Ralph has been the president since 2006, which is now 12 years. And we're very excited that Ralph can join us. New Jersey is obviously in the midst, and has been for a while, of looking at how to balance and develop a more comprehensive approach to low emissions and low carbon electric generation, from renewable expansions to preserving existing nuclear plants. And Ralph will be able to talk a little bit about that and what he's been thinking about. The other thing I like to mention about Ralph is also that people don't realize that he's also a PhD in physics. And I love it when we have a scientist and an MBA working together in one brain to think about how to move forward with these very complicated issues, and being able to translate it into things that members of the General Assembly and members of the public can understand. So Ralph, come on up, and when you're done talking, we'll do a little conversation on a couple of things. Thanks, Ralph.
Introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and most importantly, thank you for all you've done throughout your career in support of protecting our environment and on this particularly critical issue. So at PSEG, we have a three-part vision of what electricity and natural gas utilities should look like in the future. Part one, believe it or not, is that people should use as little as possible, and that the all too often forgotten critical element in energy policy is energy efficiency. That no one in this room, not even yours truly, woke up this morning saying, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour. We may have woken up saying, I can't wait to watch tonight's NBA basketball game, or I can't wait to host some friends or read a book under a light. But electricity and natural gas are a means to an end and not an end in and of themselves. And to the extent that people can live their lives using energy far more efficiently than today, that should be rule number one. However, one cannot rely on energy efficiency to eliminate the need for the supply of electricity and natural gas. So the second part of our vision is that whatever is supplied should be as clean as possible. And increasingly clean now takes as a given traditional pollutants and looks more at things like CO2. So we know about mercury, we know about SO2, we know about fine particulates. And that's really what I'd like to talk to you about today, is that second part, which is as clean a supply as possible, which is why the report that C2ES is coming out with is so timely. And then number 3, which I won't go into much today at all, is the fact that since we've reduced it, and since what we're delivering is as clean as possible, it must be delivered with a level of reliability and resiliency unmatched by anything in the past. So what has happened on this notion of cleaning up our supply over the past decade or so? I actually can remember back to the actually it was the late 1980s when I worked for the governor of New Jersey, Tom Kean, as a science policy advisor. And a not very well-known scientist named Jim Hansen came to us and said, you know, you ought to focus on climate change. And Governor Kean at that time had us develop a report that said, think globally but act locally. Not much happened for a better part of 2 decades. And I was genuinely excited when a decade ago Congress began to take on this challenge. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to testify in front of several committees on the importance of putting a price on carbon. Unfortunately, we didn't get very far with that. We were advocates as a company and I as an individual on cap and trade system that would be mandated on the electric power industry. And despite that strong effort, the Waxman-Markey bill, the Kerry-Graham bill, we didn't realize what needed to be done, and it sort of withered on the vine. And since that time, what has changed is mounting evidence that this is a critical issue that needs to be addressed. So states have taken the lead in addressing this critical issue, and there's a few that I think you're all familiar with, but if not, let me just remind you of it. I mean, New York State, for one, realizing the threat of losing 3 nuclear power plants, mostly in the upstate region, and through the great work of some people that you'll hear from later today, Kathleen Barrόn and her colleagues at Exelon, and some work on the part of people at Entergy, managed to come up with a zero-emission credit, an implied price on carbon. Actually, I guess in New York State it was an explicit price on carbon that then backed into a price for the zero-emission credit. And then shortly thereafter in Illinois, similar action was taken to put a price on carbon through a zero-emission credit. And most recently in New Jersey, which is very similar to New York and Illinois in that nuclear power represents fully 40, 1/3, and in some cases 50% of the electricity supplied in the region, and the nuclear power plants being under tremendous risk of economic extinction because of the lack of the marketplace's ability to price the externality known as carbon, beginning to realize that, okay, we have to do something different to correct this flaw in the marketplace. And it's important to think of it that way, that these are not, and perhaps I'm championing my book here, we are not advocating for an intrusion into the marketplace that isn't justified. What we are saying is that markets are very efficient allocators of resources in the near term. But everyone knows that markets are not efficient allocators of resources when there are externalities that are difficult to price. And in the case of nuclear, the 2 externalities we talk about the most are far and away, number 1, carbon, and number 2 is the fuel diversity aspect associated with nuclear. And given the lack of explicit recognition of that in the marketplace, there needs to be action by someone else. Far and away, our preference in the case of carbon would be national policy, but in the absence of that, we applaud the efforts of states, in particular what New York and Illinois and Connecticut and New Jersey have done. Let me talk a little bit about the New Jersey situation, since that's what I know a little bit more about than what's happened in New York and in Illinois. First of all, we're a 115-year-old company. We've been in New Jersey a long, long time. There are some things we can do to leave the state to protect our financial interests, but by and large, as New Jersey goes, so goes PSEG. We cannot move our wires. We cannot move our pipes. Our power plants cannot be put on the back of a truck and moved. We have no interest in doing anything other than what's in the best interest of the state of New Jersey. And I'll offer as evidence of that the following 2 little factors. In the past 10 years, we have retired 4,000 megawatts of power plants in New Jersey. One such action that resulted in the retirement of about 800 megawatts got a little bit of press attention because they were coal plants. And they were coal plants that had been retrofitted to the tune of about $1 billion for traditional pollutants just a few years prior. So that got a story for maybe a day or 2 in the press. Other than that, we didn't knock on anyone's door. We didn't approach the legislature. We didn't warn the governor other than to tell him, don't worry, we're going to get these 200 people who work at these plants other jobs. And why is that? Because there really was no social value of keeping those plants running. There was no shareholder value, there was no environmental value, there was no customer value. So 4,000 megawatts went away. As we face the same circumstances for our 3,500, so 3,500 is a smaller number than 4,000, as we all know, nuclear plants, we said, this we cannot do without warning people of what the implications are. And the implications are significant. You'll hear later from Dean and his colleagues at the Brattle Group about a study that we did in terms of the impacts on New Jersey if we were to close 3,500 megawatts of nuclear power plants in New Jersey, which provide 40% of the electricity in the state. And we talked about it in 4 terms. Number 1 was the environmental impact. If you just use the dispatch curve in PJM, and there's more than enough power to replace the electricity coming from those plants, this was not a claim that the lights would go out, you'd be introducing 14 million tons of carbon per year into the state. The equivalent of, I think, 3 million gasoline-powered automobiles using average mileage estimates. Number 2, you would be raising power prices in the state because of the way in which PJM dispatches by about $400 million per year. That, by the way, was verified not only by the Brattle Group, but by a study sponsored by the Nuclear Energy Institute through IHS Markit, and a study that did not get much publicity by the Environmental Defense Fund, certainly over the first 5 years. And then there are some projections made beyond that that change that $400 million number. But I would be a little cautious about how much one can really predict anything that's happening 6 years out into the future. Number 3, the economic impact on the state would be devastating. Our assumption, the analysis we saw was that to the tune of about $800 million, largely driven by the loss of 1,600 jobs of people who were employed by PSEG. And then depending upon your extrapolation, that 1,600 could be a number as large as 6,000 because of the refueling outages and subsequent support services. And last but not least, New Jersey is basically a 2-fuel state. We are either fueled by nuclear or by natural gas, and the loss of nuclear would mean that New Jersey's in-state generation was 100%, well, actually 90% natural gas. There's some methane gas, there's a little bit of solar, and some out-of-state wind. And that's not to suggest that there's not an abundance of natural gas, but it is to suggest that there is not an abundance of natural gas delivery capability. And during some significant weather events in New Jersey, we have had to switch our gas plants to oil, which, as you know, has a much higher carbon footprint. And in some cases, the delivery of the natural gas in the absence of nuclear would literally have us choosing between whether we could heat a customer's home or whether we can illuminate a customer's home. But in the absence of nuclear, we would not be able to do both. So with those 4 major issues before us, we approached the legislature and said, you know, despite the fact that New York and Illinois did some smart things, they kind of waited until disaster was at their door. And we ought to get ahead of this. So rather than guarantee us a payment, why not guarantee us a safety net? And I'm delighted to say that after 6 months of extensive testimony, Bob kind enough to be one of the people testifying, the legislature acted on April 12th in an overwhelming bipartisan way, 60 out of 80 votes in the Assembly, 30 out of 40 votes in the Senate, to say, yes, let's build a safety net, and a safety net that is full of consumer protections, including a 1-year-long process by the State Board of Public Utilities, that's what we call it in New Jersey as opposed to Public Utility Commission, to force us to open up our books to prove that the plants absent this payment for their carbon attributes would be at risk of closure. That process is one that would be repeated every 3 years to demonstrate economic viability versus economic risk. In addition to that, the bill requires that if there ever is a regional or a national solution that involves the payment for the attributes that we just talked about, primarily the 2 that we focused on were fuel diversity and carbon, that payment that is achieved through whatever mechanism was put into place would be subtracted from the state payment. And number 3, that there would just be a blanket affordability issue, that if power prices rose to the point where payment for this attribute was simply too much of a burden for consumers, the Board of Public Utilities could reduce that payment to us. Why 3 years? There are some major auctions that take place in New Jersey that allow for fairly confident degree of prediction of the economic performance of the plants over a 3-year time frame. It's obviously a lot stronger over a 1-year time frame. It gets a little weaker over 2, but 3, we have some confidence remaining. Beyond that time frame, it's really anyone's guess where power prices are going. So with that in hand, the bill that passed also had 2 companion pieces of legislation that went along with it. One was an extremely large expansion of the renewable portfolio standard in New Jersey. So the second law mandates that by the year 2020, New Jersey received 21% of its electricity from what are referred to as Class 1 renewables. You should think of that as solar and wind. And that by 2025, that 21% becomes 35%. And by 2030, that 35% becomes 50%, with the target of 2050 having 0 carbon emissions in the state of New Jersey. I can tell you that we are solidly supportive of those targets, and as solidly supportive as we are of those targets, we are 100% convinced that the only rational way to achieve that is by making full use of nuclear's existing license extensions to be the bridge to that kind of carbon-free future. New Jersey's already a fairly low carbon footprint state. Unlike many other states, stationary sources are not the #1 cause of carbon emissions in the state of New Jersey. Transportation is, and our hope is with the further electrification of transportation and the further electrification of the economy writ large, that this combination of investment in renewables, this continuation of nuclear, can yield an even lower carbon footprint in our state. The third companion piece of legislation is a basic pilot program for an offshore wind project. I forget the exact number of megawatts. I want to say 60, but I'm not 100% certain of that number. In the renewables legislation, there is a target for 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind and 600 megawatts of energy storage in the form of batteries. So the emphasis here is that we are completely supportive of Governor Phil Murphy, our brand new governor of New Jersey, whose signature is awaited on these 3 pieces of legislation, as a state that wants to take a comprehensive look at how to tackle the carbon reduction challenges that the state is willing to step up to. Included in the second bill, the renewables bill, is a significant energy efficiency component that we as a company are planning to make a major announcement probably in about a month's time of the role we want to play in that regard. But without question, the importance of nuclear is probably best summarized through the work of that was recently published by a group, I'll mention them by name, the Scott Madden Group, which took a look at the renewables development that took place in the United States over the past 10 years and how much wind and solar was put into play. And if you look at the currently identified at risk of closing nuclear plants, if they were to go away, we would be wiping out 2/3 of the carbon emissions that were saved by that renewable development across the nation in the past 10 years. So we don't want to take giant step backwards by watching nuclear plants prematurely retire. We don't want to take that step backwards for a variety of reasons. And with that, I think what I'd like to do is, Bob, join you for further dialogue on any issues that you may want to raise.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Ralph, for that and for the work that you all are doing in New Jersey. I also want to thank you for your leadership nationally with your colleagues in the power industry and the work that you do there. I want to talk very quickly about a chart. Well, I want to, characterize this chart as not our projections of what will happen in the future, but this is something that could happen in the future. And this is a chart that goes out to the middle of the century, 2050. And what we're trying to show here with the blue line is the full amount of zero-emitting energy electricity in the United States by generating capacity, which we need to get to be about 80% non-carbon emitting by the middle of the century. We have to recognize that unlike other pollutants, once carbon is in the atmosphere, it's in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And so there's a finite capacity to put more in the atmosphere. So any more we put up there is using up that finite capacity. With ozone pollution, which is bad, once you stop emitting the sources, the ozone pollution goes away. Here, the pollution stays in the atmosphere and continues to create the greenhouse effect on through. So what we want to do is make the blue line at the top keep going up, probably even faster than this chart shows. But what we're showing here is that the red line, which is our current nuclear generation, if you just look at their current licensing, what will happen as it fades away during the middle of the century, a straight line is if we can extend some of those licenses. And what is more interesting is that red line could go down faster if there's premature closures. And by premature, we mean before their existing licenses close. And so I'm trying to see the color there. It looks like a grayish line. Is it gray, the renewable? So we have wind and solar going up right now very quickly as we have the production tax credits and investment tax credits, which is really making a great boost and a great addition to our zero emitting. And then the Energy Information Agency at the federal government gives a projection. Now that projection out into the future, it could be higher, it could be lower. Most of us hope it's going to be higher, but that's the current projection out there. What you see at the top is if the nuclear fades away for premature closure or doesn't get relicensed, the gap between what we could be getting with zero emitting generation starts to get bigger. And in fact, the growth in renewables in 10 years out is essentially just treading water, keeping up for the loss of zero emitting power from nuclear. And so this is one of the themes of our report, is that it's time for renewable energy and nuclear energy to think about how they do this together, which is what Ralph was just talking about in New Jersey. And this is a hard thing to do sometimes, but what we really need to be thinking about is how much carbon we can put in the atmosphere and how we can get these to zero emitting sources for fuel diversity as well as for the attributes with climate change and others, pollutants, how important it is for our near-term future into the middle of this century. So it's always, what was I saying, making predictions is really tough, especially about the future. But what we try to do is look here at what things could happen, and you can vibrate around a little bit on these lines. But the bottom line is the best we're going to do for zero emitting energy in the next 30 years is going to be getting nuclear and renewable to work together to maximize both of them. Ralph, what was the biggest challenge, I think, in New Jersey to get to the point that you have?
I think that that's an excellent question, Bob, because it's a serious issue that I worry about writ large. The biggest challenge was the lack of understanding around A, the environmental imperative, and B, the economics. Let me just give you an example. There was a significant part of the environmental community, and there remains a significant part of the environmental community, that was arguing, so the implied payment in the legislation in New Jersey is about $300 million a year. And the claim was, we really shouldn't be spending this on nuclear, we should be spending this on renewables. That $300 million will keep 30 terawatt hours a year of carbon-free energy operating. New Jersey is blessed with many things. It does not have an abundant wind resource, so the primary renewable development in New Jersey is solar. The current SREC price in New Jersey is $250 a megawatt hour. If you do the arithmetic, that means the 30 terawatt hours of nuclear, if you just took that $300 million and moved it to solar, would result in not 30 terawatt hours, but 4 terawatt hours. So just a tremendous loss of carbon-free energy. And the national environmental groups understood it, and then they were saying, no, we have to keep these plants online just for the rest of their license, but not in perpetuity. The other thing that so that was on the environmental front, was just getting people to understand, no, this is not one or the other, right? You need to have both working together. The other was not related to the environment, was the economic argument. And people don't really understand the arcane way in which PJM dispatches power. It's basically on a short-run marginal cost basis. And,
There you go.
And it was like, oh, okay, what does that mean? And some of my colleagues who are here with me will remember the painful moment I had where a legislator asked me, well, why is it if your plants go away and they're not making enough money, prices go up? And I explained to him least cost economic dispatch and short-run marginal cost and inframarginal revenues. And I could just see he had this pained look in his face, and his eyes started spinning in his sockets. And I said, that didn't make any sense, did it, Assemblyman? He says, no, it didn't. So and I left the topic right there. But it was
You remember, I had advertised that you were able to explain these things.
Yeah, I know. I didn't do a very good job. So it was two things. It was, number one, why should we pay for this? And this is not good for the environment. And the way it manifested itself, which I try to use with people, is that there were groups of adversaries where there were consumer groups aligned with our competitors. And I would say to them, you want prices to go up and you want prices to go down. Tell me which one of you is going to lose when you get this common outcome. And similarly, we had, candidly, some fossil fuel groups opposing us. At the same time, environmental groups were opposing us. And I said, okay, you want fossil fuels to not be used. You want fossil fuels to be used. You can't both be right. Both of those patently logical arguments carried no weight at all. We had to sit down with legislators one-on-one and say to them, I know what I've got to do to protect the company. The plants are going away unless you do this. And then we showed them the economic benefits, the environmental benefits, and that logic in one-on-one meetings carried the day.
C2ES obviously is a very market-based oriented group. We agree, like you mentioned in your talk here, that what the best solution here would be is a national pricing regime that provides the value to zero emissions, whether it's renewable or nuclear, to the society. And as I think we point out in our report, and as probably most people are pretty aware of, there's not an active set of activities going on in the nation's capital to think about that right now, and which then, as you mentioned, defaults to the state a little bit. And we try to encourage that and support that, but it is not the most efficient. If you're an economist, it's not the most efficient way. But I think right now, given all the different factors, we certainly find ourselves, as you pointed out, supporting these state-level solutions. But you also mentioned something I think that's really important, because pricing also can help here. And that is, we should use as little as possible. Right. And I should have mentioned this when I introduced you, that one of the things that makes you stand out perhaps above some others in the industry is your view on this. And I think you once told me when I was talking to you in the past that you have a vision how you're going to be able to economically use, have people use less of your product.
And it's very simple. So if you think of a customer bill as having a fixed cost component and a variable cost component, there are a lot of energy efficiency measures that cost less than the variable cost component.
To build more.
To build more. So you make that energy efficiency investment, customer pays you the fixed cost plus the energy efficiency. They don't pay you the variable cost, so their bill goes down, right? We make money because we don't lose our fixed costs, we get recovery of that, and we make money on whatever energy efficiency investment we make. Now, this is not alchemy. There's a loser in this. The loser in this is the generation company. We're a generation company. We're willing to cannibalize the generation company. The real loser as you go far upstream is the fuel company. And we're not a fuel company, so I'm not worried about that. If we can only get the economics right, Bob, I think that chart, that blue line, would be the optimal mix of what we need. Let me try a pop quiz since we're in a school auditorium here. What is the price of carbon in New Jersey? Multiple choice. Is it $4 a ton? Is it $10 a ton? Is it $20 a ton? Or is it $400 a ton? See, there's always a smart aleck in the room. Right? But you know the answer because you've heard me give this one. It's all the above. New Jersey's trying to re-enter RGGI. That's pricing about $4 a ton right now. We have a Class 1 renewable energy certificate that prices at $5 a megawatt hour. Assume that replaces half a ton of carbon, so that's $10 a ton. We just had enacted a bill that says $10 a megawatt hour for nuclear, so that's $20 a ton. And then SREC prices, as I said before, $250 a megawatt hour. Assume $50 is a valid cost of energy. I'm being generous there, then 200 times 2 is 40. That is absurd. What are we doing? We're picking solutions with very different price points, as opposed to letting the market decide.
Yeah. Well, and of course, as you pointed out, we in the body politic has to intervene to try to find the pricing, since there's not a generic
There is not a generic way
to happen, although some of us still believe that it's possible to eventually get that to happen nationally, and there could be a role not only for Congress but also for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, as we like to call them.
Right.
Have you had any discussions with FERC?
So I read your report, and I know that there's a little bit of uncertainty as to whether or not FERC has the authority to price carbon. The conversations I've had with just a couple of commissioners, and I don't want to suggest this is dispositive, is that they are not at all convinced that they have that authority. They clearly have authority over reliability and fuel diversity and the resiliency of the system, but putting a price on carbon, unless states kind of came arm in arm saying, we want to do this to ourselves, gee, FERC, will you allow PJM to bake this into the tariff, as an example, I don't think we have much of a chance of FERC taking that action.
So before we turn to the first panel here to go deeper on this, just a little bit of thought on the future of nuclear. We're here talking about how do we properly value the existing fleet for all these different attributes. Predominantly, we're talking about its attributes of reduced pollution here, but there are others. But what do you see about the future of nuclear? I mean, I'm mentioning your PhD here a little bit.
So in terms of the long-term future of nuclear, we're going to have to look at other fuel cycles and smaller modular reactors. So a company like ours, which is in the competitive generation business, would never invest in new nuclear. I don't know what a new nuclear plant would cost today. It's probably $10 to $15 billion. The whole market value of our company is $25 billion. I'm not a gambler. I'm not going to bet the entire viability of the company on that. And absent a firm commitment to a price on carbon or a spike in gas prices, it just doesn't make economic sense. So, it's funny, my wife says that all the time. I thought she just likes to ignore me. But so I think absent a price on carbon and absent a spike in gas prices, which I don't predict either of them in the near term, competitive nuclear power just is not likely to occur. What I think is really important is that for knowledgeable, thoughtful people who worry about this issue, to realize that there's a marriage made here between renewables and existing nuclear. And then let the work take place on material sciences to drive down PV costs. Let the work take place on advanced fuel cycles to see whether or not new nuclear is more economically viable. But as long as there's as long as there's a constituency out there that says it's one or the other, I think we are really going to shortchange ourselves in terms of making progress. We will be taking giant steps backwards per your chart there.
Well, I want to thank you again, Ralph, for joining us today and giving us some of the on-the-ground experiences you've been having in your own company and in your own state, and also some of these views about the whole industry. And I think we couldn't agree more about the need for these zero-emitting technologies to be working together to the maximum benefit. And I think they'll both keep getting better into the middle of the century, but right now we have to get them to work together better. So I appreciate you coming, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Doug Vine. I'm a Senior Energy Fellow here at C2ES, and I'm so glad to see so many people here today, and thanks to everyone who's watching along on the live stream as well. It's been some time since C2ES has had a public event about nuclear power. It's actually been about 4 years. At that point in time, we talked more about the problem of early retirements and not so much about the solutions. And today, hopefully, we can talk a bit about some of those solutions. So across the United States, 5 nuclear power plants have already retired since 2012, and 9 more are expected to retire by 2025. So that's around 16,000 megawatts of generation that will have retired prematurely by 2025. To give you an idea of how big a deal that is, the quantity of generation that those plants would have generated is equivalent, it's actually just slightly higher than the total amount of solar energy that we have, solar PV that we have installed in the US today. So it's a lot of generation that are foregoing. To make matters worse, there are reports that many of the units are economically distressed, and so more retirement announcements are likely. We're concerned, as Bob and Ralph have pointed out, about these retirements because largely they're being replaced by fossil fuel fired generation. In just about every instance that we've seen to date, they've been replaced by either natural gas or even in some instances coal. So depending on where that retirement occurs, it does matter. Some grids have lower carbon intensities than others, but in the report we point out that a 1,000 megawatt retiring unit could add anywhere between 2 and 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually to our emissions. But there is action underway in the states. So this is a common theme that I think we've been saying for a couple of years now, that we're looking to the states to lead. And the actions that states have taken are helping to address the challenges that are facing nuclear power plants. The core problem, we believe, is a market failure. The wholesale power markets are not pricing the externality. They weren't designed to price the externality, but that would certainly be a remedy. The carbon benefit that they provide, if it were properly remunerated in some way, would make a lot of those units profitable. So we need policies to address this market failure, and I'm happy to say that states are acting. And I'm thrilled that we have assembled this excellent panel for you this morning. They're going to talk about some of these ideas and that have already been enacted, and some proposals that are under consideration right now. So I'm going to just briefly introduce the panel, and then we're going to have, so you should all have speaker bios as paper handouts, so I won't go through that just in the interest of time. And then we'll have some opening remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll get into a discussion. So directly on my left, we have Norris McDonald, who is the founder and president of Environmental Hope and Justice. To his left, we have Sue Tierney, who's an advisor at the Analysis Group. And then we have Kristy Hartman, who is an energy program manager at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And on the end, we have Barbara Lockwood, who is vice president of regulation at Arizona Public Service. So Norris, why don't you kick us off with some opening remarks? I'll shift the microphone over here.
Thank you, Doug. Hi, as Doug mentioned, my name is Norris McDonald. Thank you for having me on the panel today. It's a distinguished panel. I've been working on nuclear for, I guess, about 18 years now. I was one of the first, if not the first, environmentalists to publicly support nuclear power. We came out at a press conference at the National Press Club with NEI supporting Yucca Mountain back in 2001. Just a little quick background. The Environmental Hope and Justice is a product of an organization we have called the African American Environmentalist Association, and it's very targeted to that community. We also have, when we're not working on necessarily a racial angle to the energy and environmental issues, a Center for Environment, Commerce, and Energy, when we want to just work on energy and environmental issues without the racial component. Environmental Hope and Justice was formed to work specifically on nuclear power. And just a couple of items to let you think about when we get to the question and answer period. Some of our first work included supporting Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant in New York. We felt as though that was the first domino because of its proximity to New York, because of the attention that was being paid to it. So we started working that issue. One of the things we did, though, that I think was kind of interesting is that we gained full party status to the adjudication for the water permit for the plant. And that was really involved and took about a decade and a half to go through the process. But what we did in that case was we took a water issue because they were going to try to get their water permit. And we turned that into a clean air issue. Because if the power plant was shut down over not getting their water permit, the power plants that would replace that power from Indian Point would probably come from minority communities in New York City. So we were able to get full party status in the adjudication based on that premise. A couple of other items. And Bob Perciasepe is very familiar with this. We were there when we helped establish the Environmental Justice Office at EPA. And I think that was historic. A lot of work was done on that. And so we try to combine the environmental justice issue with the nuclear issue, which has been interesting in that when you close down a nuclear power plant, it's going to be replaced by a fossil plant. And we're not necessarily anti-fossil, but that's just where it happens, and it just so happens that these plants end up being in minority communities. Thus, the logical linkage of environmental justice and nuclear power, and I think that's something unique we bring to the table. I wrote the environmental justice law for New York City, and it was signed by the mayor last April, actually. And so our work combined with Indian Point and with some of our environmental justice work, such as getting laws passed, I think is kind of unique. And our latest work has been in New Jersey. And we've had, that was an interesting battle, very interesting, going through that procedure. And we presented testimony there. And an American Lung Association report showed that the counties in New Jersey are in noncompliance of the Clean Air Act. And I'll maybe get into some of that in the question period about that maze. But it was a pleasure to work on that. It was a pleasure pointing out the health effects and the problems throughout the counties in New Jersey. The American Lung Association report showed that 11 of 12 counties had a failing grade in terms of ozone and health. Most of the emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and deaths from asthma were, the percentage are high in minority communities. I'll maybe get into those demographics later, but that's a little bit about what we do.
Great, Norris, thanks. Sue, you're up next.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, how nice that is. Thank you very much. I thought I'd start because I'm kind of a talking head geek policy wonk. I thought I would give you a little bit about the perspective that I bring to describing what the states are doing. So most of my comments in this opening part are going to be to give you a landscape tour of what the states are doing and not doing. That'll be a really brief snapshot because we don't have much time here. But I wanted to tell you that I have not always been an out loud advocate for being sensible about nuclear power. I was quite opposed to it in the early part of my career. And if you look at my wrinkles, you'll know that was a long time ago. But the climate issue really brought me around to thinking about nuclear reactors, and especially existing ones, in a very different way. So I spend my time on markets and economics and reliability in the electric industry and climate issues as well. So, and in full disclosure, over the course of the past few years, I called up Entergy in the Northeast and said I would like to work with you because I'm concerned about this problem. And so I did work with them. I am currently engaged with Dominion in Connecticut working on this issue. And today and tomorrow, Karen Palmer and I have a blog on the Resources for the Future website where we talk about the various issues related to the coal and existing nuclear plant requests for federal government action. And we draw the distinction between the things that we get if we get coal versus the things that we get if there is action on nuclear. So with that, let me just describe a couple of buckets of states and how they have been acting, and then just end briefly by identifying a couple of states that have chosen not to act in response to requests. So first of all, I would just put the bucket around cap and trade programs. Certainly the 10 original and now 9 states in the regional greenhouse gas initiatives have a very light price on carbon. It is meaningful in the sense that it is a carbon price, but it is not meaningful in terms of the actual cost of carbon. What did you say, $4 a ton? Yeah, that's about the going price right now, and I think it's spiked at 7. So, and it's back down again. California has a cap and trade program that's economy-wide. It is going to be tightening over the years, as is the RGGI cap. And those markets are working seamlessly, from my point of view, with regard to how the carbon market intersects with the electric market. There are also 3 states that we heard about that have a zero emission credit program. First New York, then Illinois, and now New Jersey. These all focus on at-risk nuclear plants, and the merchant plants that are affected by these rules have to turn over their books, presumably in private, to assure that they are eligible to get the ZECs. As Ralph mentioned, I think you mentioned this, the ZEC models in each of those 3 states are not the same, and they have different prices and different currencies, if you will, and so they don't allow trading across the borders. But nonetheless, those have been very clear in providing support for certain plants, and again, not all plants. There is another type of program that has recently been enacted in Connecticut. Connecticut, the Millstone 2 and 3 units in Connecticut provide 60% of the power supply in the state. They provide 98% of the zero carbon supply in the state. And Dominion has indicated that it is anticipating retirement. The state's advisor disagreed. But the legislature has enacted a program in which existing nuclear plants in the Northeast would have the opportunity to qualify to be eligible as at risk and then submit a proposal for a long-term contract, with the anticipated situation is if a plant is not found to be at risk, its price is the market price for power. And if it is found to be at risk, it will be reviewed in terms of a variety of benefits, including what the price of power will look like in Connecticut without Millstone operating. And a colleague and I did a report on that, and that looks to be many billions of dollars. And I would be surprised if Dominion is going to offer something up to that level. But there is still a difference between with and without Millstone, and that's for the whole New England region. Finally, there is a state with a settlement agreement. Now, this is Diablo Canyon in California. It's not exactly the same. It is not a merchant plant. But increasingly, given the shape of the electricity market structure and trends in California, more and more of that supply would become merchant, in effect, as Pacific Gas and Electric, the owner of the plant, loses bundled customers as they are beginning to be served by other suppliers. Now, there are some other states that have toyed with doing something. Massachusetts, when I was working with Entergy, we proposed to Massachusetts that they adopt a clean energy standard, which would include nuclear. The conversation with the state was really upsetting. As a former cabinet officer for the environment in Massachusetts, I was very disappointed when the state officials said, we don't think that that would be tolerated by the community in Massachusetts. So whether or not it was a good idea to provide a technology-neutral clean energy standard, they did not go that way, and in fact have adopted a renewables-only clean energy standard. Actually, there's probably efficiency in there as well. By the way, I should have mentioned that in every one of the cases that I've already talked about, the nuclear program was combined with something else about zero carbon supply, whether it was a portfolio such as in Illinois of efficiency, microgrids, distributed energy resources, and renewables, or whether it is like New York, where it was an extension of their existing renewable portfolio standard. Vermont was one of the losers of a nuclear plant. Vermont was very eager to have the Vermont Yankee plant shut down until they announced that it was going to shut down, and then it was a bad surprise for them, and I think there were some discussions about whether or not they would change their position. They did not, and that plant is actually now closed. In Ohio, we know that there have been multiple attempts by First Energy to propose, among other things, that the plant go back into rate regulation, the plants, excuse me, that the state adopt some kind of approach that would pay for some missing money for the plants. And now we'll probably hear a little bit more about this in the second panel on federal approach. First Energy is asking in a variety of ways in which the federal government to act on its coal plants and its nuclear plants. And then finally, I would say it looks like Pennsylvania hasn't done anything yet, in spite of the fact that there are indications of announced retirements of 3 Mile Island. So that's your landscape tour, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Dave. That was a great overview of what we're seeing happening in states. Some states are choosing to act, and some states are a little bit confused. Some states are just happy to see them go, unfortunately. So this being Washington, D.C., our next speaker, Kristy Hartman from the National Conference of State Legislatures, is going to get a little bit more into the detail of what's going on in the state legislatures. You're going to provide us with some statistics and additional information building on what Sue's put forth.
Well, thank you, Doug, and I look forward to talking a little bit more. I think Sue highlighted a lot of great state examples, and I can maybe provide a little bit more context from the legislative perspective as I talk about some of these state examples. But just wanted to back up, the National Conference of State Legislatures were the only nonpartisan organization serving all legislators and legislative staff in the 50 states, commonwealths, and territories. We basically provide unbiased research on any topic that is of interest to legislatures. So I say that because, certainly within the energy sector, nuclear has become a real hot topic for state legislators, and we're getting tons of questions. Questions from states maybe that you wouldn't even, it wouldn't be on your kind of first list of states that would be asking these types of questions. It's really all over the country. And so we've really turned our focus in the last year and a half to try to provide resources and support to states as they look at all these different policies. So just to give a little more context, in the 2017 legislative session, more than 30 states considered more than 100 bills. And many of these looked at retaining the current U.S. nuclear fleet, but they also looked at the never-ending questions over storage and disposal of commercial nuclear waste. They looked at how state legislatures can support advanced reactor technologies. And so even though kind of looking towards the current nuclear fleet, those bills are specific to states with certain market conditions. But if you look just at nuclear bills in general across the country, they really are not regionally specific, and they were introduced by both parties, which is not always the case when we're looking at different energy resources. So just for a comparison, in 2016, 19 states considered 64 bills. So we've seen a big increase in the last year, and for 2018, we're only halfway through the year. Many legislative sessions are wrapping up, though, and I'd say we're around 100 bills. So we're seeing this continued interest of what state policymakers can do. And the point is that these measures are important, and state legislators play an important role to either support or restrict actions when it comes to nuclear generation. So I wanted just to take a couple minutes and talk about the different types of bills that we're seeing. One of the first I wanted to mention is just sort of general support legislation. So these oftentimes don't really come with a mandate. It's just the legislature saying, hey, we support this technology or we support this policy. There was a fly right in front of me. So in Arizona, for example, last year they adopted a resolution that urges Congress and the EPA to recognize nuclear as a clean energy source. They also adopted a resolution that basically just says we're here to provide legislative support for nuclear energy. They're not really talking about anything specific, but just signaling to the state, to the community, to the industry that we support nuclear power. Similarly, we have other states. Pennsylvania created the first joint nuclear energy caucus in the state. They have met several times. They've discussed different potential legislation. As Sue mentioned, we haven't really seen much come from the state. There is one resolution out, but no actual requirements. I think in Pennsylvania, they're dealing with a political landscape in an election year that makes them very hesitant to take immediate action. In Maryland, as well, they are most recently created another nuclear energy caucus. So these are the first that we've seen in the country. It's state legislators getting together to at least start a dialogue on some of these issues. So next kind of big broad topic, how states are looking at policies that value low carbon generation. As Sue mentioned, we have ZECs, that's sort of the big forefront policy that states are considering. I just wanted to add, to what she was saying, New York's interesting because it was driven by the Public Service Commission and not legislatively driven. And I think in the legislature, New York's a pretty interesting case. It's not clear that a bill like this or a measure like this could have passed the legislature. So in New York, it really had to come from a different avenue. In Illinois and New Jersey, it was legislatively driven, and as Sue mentioned as well, these policies probably couldn't stand alone just looking at nuclear generation. In Illinois, they brought a ton of stakeholders to the table, and the final outcome, the bill provides a lot for renewable energy, energy efficiency, as well as the ZECs program. Similarly, in New Jersey, it was a group of bills that all kind of went through together that support a variety of technologies. I also think it's interesting to look at the reason that these bills passed in the state. When the New York PSC was talking about these measures, they really stressed sort of the environmental components of why this was needed. Whereas in Illinois, they talked less about the environment and more about reliability and fuel diversity. In Illinois, at least from the legislative perspective, they said, okay, let's see if natural gas can take some of this load. They were really hesitant to, invest in natural gas generation and get that up and running in time. And just looking at the percentage of natural gas generation in the state, the legislature at least came together and decided that it was important to keep those nuclear plants in operation. I want to move on to just quickly mention renewable portfolio standards, because this is an opportunity, I think, for nuclear and something that state policymakers are talking about. Currently, 29 states and DC have mandatory RPS requirements. Nuclear really isn't considered in most of these RPS standards. Indiana has a voluntary RPS requirement, and basically they say 30% of their goal can be met by nuclear, but again, it's voluntary. Ohio also has advanced technologies for nuclear in the state's RPS, but otherwise we really haven't seen nuclear considered in a state RPS until the last couple legislative sessions, where states have started to come out and say, well, should nuclear be considered a clean energy source and be considered in a state's mandate for renewable portfolio standards. New Mexico last year did just that. They introduced a measure that basically just added the word nuclear to the state's RPS. The bill failed on party lines, but I think the legislators' intent was to at least get a discussion going. And New Mexico is kind of interesting, given that there aren't nuclear plants. The other aspect to that is there are, some political considerations for state legislators as they look at renewable portfolio standards and whether it's worth sort of reopening a state's RPS to try to add nuclear, but that could, maybe have some issue once you kind of open up a bill to relook at a state's RPS, would it be better to do a separate nuclear energy standard? So there's a number of states that are looking at maybe some type of mandate specifically for nuclear. We haven't seen a lot of action, but we've seen a few states at least bring that up in discussions. And I want to quickly wrap up, but I wanted to mention there are, and I know Barbara's going to talk about this a little bit more, but there's a number of states that are looking at changes to their RPS. There's a big push, and 3 states in particular, Arizona, which I know Barbara will talk about, Nevada, and Michigan. I think Michigan's a really interesting case of increasing their state's RPS. It doesn't currently include anything for nuclear, but the state has 4 reactors, which generate almost 30% of the state's electricity. And so as they're having these conversations on renewables, there's this other kind of component of should nuclear be considered in those conversations as well. And lastly, just one other kind of plug for carbon tax and cap and trade. Of course, we're not expecting some big action to come in the next or foreseeable future, but we are seeing an increase again in states looking at different policies. So as of March, 8 states have carbon tax legislation under consideration. 7 states have cap and trade legislation, and another 7 states have at least introduced studies. So we're seeing a lot of discussion going on in the states. And one kind of last plug, NCSL published a report that looks at if a state wants to take action to retain the current U.S. nuclear fleet, here are some policy options that they could consider. We published this with the support of the Department of Energy, we've kind of used this as a resource for state policymakers. So with that, I think I'll end there.
Thanks, Kristy. That was great. So Barbara comes to us from Arizona, a state known for its high temperatures. In fact, Phoenix just last Sunday hit a record high of 106 degrees. So the heat waves seem to be coming earlier every year there. So Barbara, can you tell the audience about nuclear power in your state and some of the clean energy proposals that you have there?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Doug and Bob and C2ES for putting on this very important conversation. My comments are really going to be more of a case study compared to the other panelists. First of all, Arizona Public Service is Arizona's largest electric supplier. We are a vertically integrated, investor-owned utility. We are not participating in an organized market, so we do not have some of the similar pressures that other nuclear facilities are experiencing. But we do have a threat, a near-term threat to the viability of our nuclear power plant. So I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But first I wanted to give you just a few statistics about the Palo Verde generating station. Palo Verde is the largest energy producer in the U.S., not nuclear energy, not just nuclear energy, not just clean energy, but the largest energy producer in the U.S., and it's held that title for 25 years. It produces 30 billion kilowatt hours per year. It delivers $2 billion in value to the Arizona economy annually, and it powers homes for 4 million people in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. So Public Service New Mexico is a part owner of the Palo Verde generating station. Palo Verde produces 70% of Arizona's clean air energy, and it is the single largest commercial taxpayer in Arizona, paying an estimated $50 million in property taxes every year. It's also unique because it's the nation's only nuclear power plant not located on a body of water. So it actually uses reclaimed water from local cities and towns, delivers it about 30 miles to the plant, cleans it up, and uses that for cooling. Our nuclear engineers call that toilet to toaster. They're not funny often, but. So clearly, we're experiencing challenges here in the United States protecting our nuclear fleet. And even though in Arizona we are not subject to the similar market pressures that exist elsewhere in the country, we are at risk for bad policy. And that is what's happening here in Arizona right now. There is a proposal on the table that's currently being debated, and if it is successful and moves forward, the Palo Verde plant could be closed as early as 2025 or 2026, and that's a full 20 years earlier than it is currently licensed for. Palo Verde could also have the license extended for another 20 years, taking us closer to 2070, but all of that is at risk with a proposal that's currently on the table. So the proposal that's currently on the table, or one of the proposals that's currently on the table is a ballot proposition which has been promoted and funded by outside interests. This is not an Arizona initiative. This is external to Arizona, specifically Tom Steyer from California. And the stated objective is to pass a constitutional amendment, amend Arizona's constitution to require 50% of Arizona's electricity to come from clean energy sources by 2030, and nuclear power is not included in that. This ballot proposition is very specific and it's very detailed, and that's the problem. It doesn't take into account how the system actually works. As you know, electricity is produced and consumed at the same time. Solar energy is our renewable resource in Arizona. So what this goal would require is for us to add massive amounts of solar energy, which is a great thing. Solar energy, we have a tremendous amount on our system already, but to get to the goal the way it's outlined in this proposal, we would literally be awash in solar energy. And in the spring and the fall, when there's low load, that solar energy would have nowhere to go. And since you can't really turn off and turn on a nuclear plant as you feel like it, needs to run continuously, that puts great pressure and is a significant threat to Palo Verde. But it's even worse than that, as has been discussed already on this panel. What we would be replacing it with is natural gas, not solar. Because in Arizona, customers use the most energy between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. in the summertime. That's when solar's rolling off, and we have to have sufficient fast-ramping natural gas generation to meet that demand. So we're trading clean, carbon-free nuclear energy for natural gas and actually increasing emissions. That would be the conclusion of that. This is a situation that's similar to what's happening in California today. The California Independent System Operator actually pays Arizona and other states to take excess power when there's too much solar on the system. And it has started a few years ago. It is increasing rapidly and is a continuing evolution in their market as they strive for greater penetration of renewable energy. But of course we support more clean energy, and of course we support solar energy. What matters is how you go about it. The policy needs to be good, and it needs to be flexible, because 2030 is quite a ways into the future, 2050 even further. We need to be smart and flexible about how we approach our clean energy goals. In Arizona, we recently established new rate plans for our customers that encourage use of energy during the daytime, because we've got so much solar on the system, as does our neighbor, California. We actually brought the price of energy down to 3 cents a kilowatt hour between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. to encourage customers to use more energy in that time period by doing things like pre-cooling their homes. If we can make that shift and move some of that consumption to that time period, it will help us maintain baseload nuclear power operating throughout the day so that it's there at other times when solar is not providing energy. We're going to fight as hard as we can to keep Palo Verde open and fight bad policy that would threaten it. And that takes me to another proposal that's being discussed in Arizona. And this is an alternative from Arizona Corporation Commissioner Andy Tobin. He has offered a plan that would require 80% clean energy by 2050. Importantly, this plan embraces nuclear energy, it embraces Palo Verde. The state has been incredibly supportive of Palo Verde. Kristy mentioned the legislation that was passed by Arizona, and just generally across the board, the state policymakers understand the significance and the value of the plant. So Tobin's plan also is a flexible plan, and it also takes advantage of emerging technologies like battery storage, energy efficiency, demand-side management, and all of the suite of tools that we're going to need to make this work at the end of the day. So devils are in the details in that plan. It has not been approved yet. It has not come into fruition, but it is something that is real-time being debated and discussed. And that is, it would be essentially replacing the renewable portfolio standard in Arizona. APS is committed to more clean energy. Already half of our generation comes from carbon-free resources. We have over 1,300 megawatts of solar on our system. We have energy storage in our system, and we're planning for more. And we are leading the way with research and development in that respect. We recently announced a groundbreaking project that we believe is going to be a model for the future. We've partnered with another great Arizona company, First Solar, and are moving forward with a solar plus storage project. It's 65 megawatts of solar and 50 megawatts of battery storage. But the unique thing about it is that this project will only deliver energy to APS between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m., exactly when we need it and exactly when our customers use the most energy. So we really think that this is going to be a model that's going to set the way, certainly for us in Arizona and hopefully for others, in terms of innovation with respect to how we move forward with more clean energy. So bottom line is Palo Verde and nuclear energy is essential to a carbon-free future, and we're doing all that we can to further support and ensure its operation for the long term.
Thanks, Barbara. I think that's a great lead-in to my first question, and this is really to everyone on the panel. So for a long time, environmental groups have not been particularly supportive of nuclear power, and perhaps a lot of this has its roots in how many environmental groups or the timing of when many environmental groups were formed. So in spite of a push by many groups, including C2ES, highlighting the large environmental benefit that the US nuclear fleet has, helping us avoid millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide, many mainline environmental groups are not advocating for nuclear power. At best, they've been silent on the issue as they promote their agendas. So I put it to each of you, how do you think that we can bridge this political divide? Can nuclear and renewables be complementary? How can the different parties work together? So Norris, would you like to start us off with that very easy question?
Well, having come up through the environmental movement since 1979, I think so. At one point, we had the largest team of anti-nuclear lobbyists in Washington, D.C. with what's now Friends of the Earth. It was the Environmental Policy Center, Environmental Policy Institute. Most people remember that. And at that time, from 80 to 85, it was the largest funded project. So it kept the organization afloat. So, you know, if you want to get environmental groups to support nuclear power, maybe the nuclear power companies should just fund the environmental groups.
Cha-ching. I guess I would offer that the environmentalist group is not a homogeneous group. And it's made up of a whole lot of different, very local to very global types of organizations, many of which are pretty much one issue. That's not the case for many of the larger ones, but many local ones are quite focused on water quality associated with one facility. I love the way that you guys turned a water quality issue into an air issue, because that's actually how the world works in a lot of cases. But I think that the tribal nature of the environmental group could learn from potentially from some of the other constituencies who have advocacy arms, where they decide that they are really going to not eat each other's children, but that they work together to try to find some goals. And I do think that moving the conversation from, well, if you're for nuclear, you're against renewables, or if you're for renewables, you're against nuclear, into something that is more practical and realistic. I mean, I think about the many studies that have been done about the urgency of climate change and the difficulty of really getting there without a portfolio of supplies. So I am very concerned when I see legislators going with 100% by date X of renewables, because we don't know how we would do that now. We simply don't know how we would keep the lights on if we did that. And so finding pathways that do and discussions, I think, are very important. But that's not why I'm not an elected official, because no one would vote for that approach.
Kristy?
I think, the Illinois legislature should be applauded for bringing so many stakeholders to the table when, they were looking at their ZEX program. And so I think policymakers, even in a, more contentious political environment, certainly serve their constituents and want everyone at the table. And so maybe we'll see more of this going forward as we look at some of these issues and they're falling into the laps of state legislatures, and states are really kind of on the hook to find immediate solutions.
Yeah, that's certainly an approach that we called out in the paper, that building a big tent coalition can go a long way to getting a lot of support. And you had groups like NEI and Sierra Club both applauding the Future Energy Jobs Act in Illinois. It was pretty amazing.
I would certainly concur with that, bringing a large group of stakeholders together. I have to make a plug for, as the utility person, for more education around how the system actually operates. And we have been very successful in flying under the radar for so long because we didn't necessarily need our customers or our constituents to understand how the system actually works. But we're getting to the point now where it's just necessary to talk about the practical realities. We have, I think of our customers, there's the environmental groups, and we've had some very good success with some very reasonable groups in our space, and then there are others who are solely focused on 100% renewable. And I think of our customers as well. We have customers who their goal is 100% renewable, but they don't really understand what that means or what it takes to get there. And it hasn't mattered yet. It hasn't mattered. You could have a company that vowed to go 100% renewable, and they did it through renewable energy credits or however their accounting mechanism worked. And it was just a small part of the equation. So the larger system just continued to function as it was. But we're getting to the point where we really have to have those pragmatic discussions with large stakeholder groups about how the system works and how we're going to get where we need to go, and get beyond just the bumper sticker, policy goals that are out there.
Doug, could I just add one
Sure,
more thing?
sure.
And one of the things we know that in the era in which renewable and efficiency strategies didn't feel, the advocates for those didn't feel that they had a group of companies listening to them. They had to be very sharp-elbowed and very effective in trying to speak for their particular strategy. But I think this is a different phase of the discussion. The markets are driving and consumers are driving a lot of interest in renewables, and that is fantastic. That's fantastic. But we now, again, need to think about it more realistically.
Great. So Kristy, I actually wanted to turn to you because I know I want to be more solutions focused. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a lot of the legislative actions, but are there other things that legislatures do that can help promote policies?
Well, I think, when I mention 100 bills have been introduced, we all know 100 bills aren't going to pass. And a lot of times, I think the intent of the legislature or a particular sponsor of a measure is not to get the bill passed, but to start a dialogue. And so whether that's just holding a public hearing, having the bill out there, just getting a little bit of knowledge and discussion going plays a pretty large role in this process. And so I'd even argue, in Pennsylvania, having the Nuclear Energy Caucus, they probably started it, thought it was pretty unlikely that they would come up with a bill, whether or not individual legislators may have wanted it or not. But I think it's more about the signal that they're sending. I Some would argue the legislature needs to do more, but I think in that case, it's a pretty strong, I guess, in Pennsylvania's case, support for nuclear power in the state. And so I would suggest that there are other things besides just passing the bill.
Right. So another point that I wanted to bring up as well was, we often focus on the carbon dioxide, the long-term issue, and Norris alluded to this in his opening remarks about some of the health effects. I don't think you brought up smog. I think you wanted to talk a bit about ozone and some of those effects as well.
Well, as I mentioned about New Jersey, to the legislators there, we pointed out the specific health effects in their counties, and I think they're really responsive to that sort of information. I think another unique approach, and I think in New Jersey it was a unique approach, for instance, is that New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy signed an environmental justice executive order just 2 weeks ago. So he has an obvious interest in environmental justice issues. And so I think it's a way to make the issue hit home. I mean, carbon is important, but thousands of people will die from air-related health effects, this year. So it's something that they can relate to directly, especially in vulnerable communities. Their constituents are right there. I mean, I'm a chronic acute asthmatic myself. I'm not ashamed to pull out my inhaler at the hearings to let them know. Smog day is a smog day, and actually our standards are higher than EPA standards. Our standard for a non-attainment day is if you can see the air, it's not healthy to breathe. That's the bottom line. A number of areas in non-attainment have a few non-attainment days, but a non-attainment day is a non-attainment day. But like I said, if you can see it, it's not healthy to breathe, and it's surely not healthy for kids to be out there playing in it. And I think another good aspect is that, my son inherited asthma from me, as I inherited it from my father. You can't put a price on your child being in the emergency room. You wouldn't put a price on it. There is no price to stop that asthma attack in that emergency room at that moment. So when you're talking about putting a price on nuclear, put that price on there. A child struggling to breathe, basically suffocating because of smog pollution during a summer day.
Thank you. A very important point. I wanted to open it up for questions. We have just a few minutes left, so we have a couple of mics going around the room, or maybe just one. So if you could just state your name and your affiliation, please, before your question.
Thank you. Stephen Dolly with S&P Global Platts. I edit our newsletter inside NRC. Thank you all for, and Mr. Izzo is, I guess, not here anymore.
He's there. He's there.
Blended into the
Thank you all for a very informative presentation. I know we don't have much time, but I was hoping some of you, maybe Kristy or some of you could talk about, we're all trying to absorb and understand the New Jersey legislation, but if adopted, my understanding is that the BPU, after a review, would have the authority to possibly authorize certificates for some out-of-state generating units if they're selling electricity to New Jersey utilities. You can see my understanding is fairly limited. That's my question. What's the nature of that provision? What might be some implications for out-of-state generators and their options for getting some certificates?
This is probably a better question for Ralph, but and I haven't read the final bill. I know in the drafts that definitely was the case, and that was a big point for New Jersey that is different from any of the other states. But besides that,
Well, I think it goes to the point that is also true in It goes to the point that is also true in Connecticut, that if you're part of a regional market and you are concerned about interstate commerce clause violations, says she who's not an attorney, you can't, it's very difficult to have a law written in which you are categorically excluding out-of-state supply as qualifying to participate in that. So I think it goes to that. Same would be, as I said, same would be true in Connecticut. If you can deliver your power from Seabrook in New Hampshire into the Connecticut market, or even from a New York resource into the Connecticut market. So I understand that New Jersey's a comparable issue.
And just kind of adding back onto that again, I think, there's challenges in every state that has a ZEX program. So far, the courts have basically sided with the state on these programs. But like Sue said, I think it's, as the legislature looks at how to get kind of these programs implemented, is maybe looking for kind of the safest bet to get these through.
So I think Ralph's going to.
Sue nailed it, right? So interstate, the wholesale power markets are interstate commerce, and what the New Jersey legislation simply says that the state has said up to 40% of the power should come from nuclear, and we will rank nuclear power plants in accordance with certain impacts that are most important to New Jersey, and then the board of public utility will decide which plants receive priority treatment.
In the back row.
Yes, and this is more for Arizona, but could apply to anyone in a similar situation. So given the excess of solar that could be generated under a new bill, has a new proposal, has there been any attempt to coordinate with other state legislatures about more robust and higher capacity grid interconnections? So there would actually be a means of offloading the excess, and even for Arizona to be exporting the excess solar. Let's say if you have 50% solar, remainder nuclear, that's plenty to export during off-peak. So has there been any proposals to enable a greater export during off-peak through better interconnections?
Well, certainly there is quite a bit of activity right now in the West, looking at additional market options. We do not participate in a full organized market, but we are a member of the California Energy Imbalance Market. And I think the challenge in the West is that everybody's going to be in that situation. I don't know where it goes at the end of the day.
Federal level.
What's that?
Federal level.
Federal level. I mean, I guess if we could export it to I don't know, the Midwest. The challenge is, it really is, it's a problem for Arizona, it's a problem for California, it's a problem for Nevada, and that's where all the people are. So you can't really export it unless you have somewhere to send it. I get your point, though. If we're looking at a national transmission build-out that could then ship wind from the Midwest wherever it needs to go, and solar from the Southwest wherever it needs to go, that would be an alternative to make more progress there. That's much as clear.
And the Western discussions are reflecting the fact that there are different times in which each of those areas would peak, but at the end of the day, it is still the daylight part of the day, and that there are some challenges of the dark period.
So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Barbara, Kristy, Sue, Norris, thank you for an excellent discussion. And please join me in thanking these panelists.
Well, again, thank you all for being here. And this panel has been tasked with tackling the federal side of this. Doug described it to me as we would be more speculative. So I can only say that I've done a little bit of work with transformative scenario planning. Scenario planning, of course, is when you think about what might happen and you think how you will react to it. Transformative scenario planning is when you think about how do you shape what you want to have to react to. And I think that we have a fabulous panel here to do exactly that. One of the complexities, of course, that we are dealing with in tackling this problem is all the many competing interests. We are trying to solve a carbon problem, but while we maintain a reliable and resilient grid, and one that is serving our ratepayers in the ways in which they want to be served. So today we've brought together a group of panelists who bring together, I think, all of the disciplines that we need to address this area and to think, to start telling the stories about what might possibly be, what are the possibilities for the future. Because we have on this panel economists, engineers, lawyers, policy experts, all of these sometimes combined in all the same people. So with that, since you all do have biographies written out. I will not give a great deal of introduction here other than titles. Our first speaker is going to be Ben Renke. Ben is, this is a long title here, professional staff member of the majority staff of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources under the leadership of Chairman Lisa Murkowski. So he'll be able to help us get our hands around what is happening at the federal level in terms of legislation, the sort of policy, legal, and public interest response to this question. Following that, Kathleen Barrόn will, she's the Senior Vice President, Competitive Market Policy for Exelon Corporation. She'll help us address some of the more commercial issues and the practical realities of trying to operate in this market when you are part of one of the major power suppliers for this section of the country. And then at the end, Dean Murphy, who is with the Brattle Group, has a background in both engineering and as an economist, will help us try to put all this together and see the bigger picture, and we'll save some time at the end for questions and commentary from the audience and hopefully among the panelists too. We've certainly had a lot of research that suggests that clean energy standards and carbon pricing are major and perhaps favored policies, but I hope that today this panel will go beyond that and will really explore a lot of possibilities. And with that, Ben.
Thank you, Donna. Can everybody hear me all right? Or is this maybe it's on? So I wanted to hit on a couple things quickly. And I have a lot to say, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. There are 6 questions that I think are relevant to this discussion, and in my opening remarks, I'm going to try to talk about 3 of those and then kind of maybe seed the others for later. The first one is, how do we reconcile the optimism that has been displayed in advanced nuclear with the market challenges facing the current fleet? And for that, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of my story with the committee. So I joined the committee directly out of graduate school when I finished a PhD in nuclear engineering. And when I came into the committee, I began working directly on advanced nuclear legislation in early January of 2016. And at that time, there was a lot of sort of unbridled optimism around advanced nuclear. In fact, the third week that I was there, we took a vote to adopt a major piece of legislation for advanced nuclear called the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Capabilities Act as the first amendment on the Senate floor for this Senate energy bill, which was a large comprehensive energy bill that had been worked on for a couple of years by our committee. That adoption actually happened the same day as Third Way's Advanced Nuclear Summit, so lots of optimism on nuclear. And that vote was 87-4, which might have been the strongest pro-nuclear vote that the Senate's passed in a very long time, if not ever. Shortly thereafter, we made it through a long slog of pushing that bill across the Senate floor, and on April 20th, that bill passed 85-12 out of the Senate. We then worked with our House colleagues extensively on negotiations, but at the end, it sort of fell apart, and we weren't able to get the bill signed into law. So we are continuing our work on that, and I'll kind of circle back to that later. That optimism in nuclear came to a head at that April 20th vote, and then immediately thereafter started to change. There's sort of a waxing and waning in the optics around nuclear. We started having many announcements in 2016 about potential nuclear closures, which I think you've heard extensively about today. But that sort of changed the dialogue around nuclear and what was going on. With that, we saw that some of those were because of political choices, but most of them were because of economic reasons. And since then, Illinois, New York, and New Jersey have tried to value attributes of nuclear. And I want you to kind of remember that as we circle back to this later, because how you value electrons is an important question for the future. So the next question is, what is the role of sort of Congress and our committee specifically? So our committee oversees the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy, and FERC. And I'm going to not talk about DOI at all because it mostly has nothing to do with nuclear. But DOE is my sort of wheelhouse. I'm an engineer by background. I'm not an economist or a lawyer. DOE's had a lot of important work that's been done in this space to date to help preserve the current fleet and set up a future for nuclear. So a couple of programs that I just mentioned, the CASTLE program, which is an advanced simulation program that has helped sort of move the economics or efficiency of today's nuclear fleet. the light water reactor sustainability program, which has to do with preserving today's fleet and figuring out how you can safely license and extend licenses into the future. And accident-tolerant fuel programs, which are still in development now, which we're not really sure exactly yet how that will affect the economics of today's fleet or tomorrow's fleet, but there's some optimism that you may be able to increase the efficiency of today's operating fleet or change some safety regulations based upon the introduction of this new technology. And then there's a lot that's been done in sort of advanced reactor development programs, and I hope we'll talk a bit more about that later. We also oversee FERC. As I mentioned, that's not my wheelhouse. I've been learning about FERC from the nuclear angle over the last several years, but we have very smart lawyers on our staff who are experts in energy law. But our role is to oversee FERC. And Senator Murkowski has actually been concerned with this problem that we're talking about here today for many years. In 2011 and 2015, she wrote letters to FERC, specifically addressing the question of price formation. And she asked FERC to open a docket on price formation, which has happened, and there have been some proceedings, but there hasn't been any major action from FERC. So she was concerned about a number of things, but one thing that she's mentioned publicly is kind of the concern about how the markets are set up to allow easy entry for natural gas and renewables, especially when heavily subsidized, but allow essentially only exit and not market entry for nuclear or coal, which is a challenge. As FERC has not sort of had major action on that docket, the states have stepped up. And so we've seen the states once again experimenting in nuclear and policy. And the states and the wholesale markets themselves are actually kind of the ultimate great experimenters in energy markets. So our committee's role in oversight of FERC is interesting. We do pass energy law, and we try to push energy policy. But as I mentioned earlier, our energy bill that we pushed very hard to get across the finish line in last Congress didn't make it. And that was for a number of different reasons, but that was the first major energy piece of legislation that could have been adopted since 2007. So if you do your math, we're now 11 years since our last major large energy law was passed into law. So it's really hard to change the law. And so when we look at our committee's role in overseeing FERC, we do have to recognize that while changing the law is challenging, we have to be sure that we're setting up the FERC and the wholesale markets for success, and that they have to have the ability to balance the state and federal roles, as well as preserve the benefits of markets while preserving the integrity of the grid, while allowing an understanding of different generation sources, populations, and needs in different states. That's really hard to do. So the last thing I'd say is our committee doesn't have any jurisdiction over tax, so I won't get into that. But that leads to the final question, which is, if nuclear is to be preserved, why does it matter? And why does nuclear matter to this country? So Senator Murkowski has no nuclear in her state, except for an old Army base that had an experimental small reactor back in the 70s. However, she's always had a strong desire to make sure that there's a robust nuclear capacity in the United States. And Alaska feels the effects of climate change directly, and so the clean energy attributes of nuclear are very important to the senator. She's also concerned, and has been, with what I mentioned earlier, writing letters about the use of nuclear in the state, or sorry, throughout the United States. But there is one other important consideration as well, and that is the role of nuclear in national security and economic opportunity. So losing the nuclear plants that we have today would mean a dwindling nuclear workforce, and it is something that concerns her directly, because it used to be that the United States was the undisputed global leader in nuclear, which meant that we had the undisputed gavel in negotiations worldwide around the sort of regulatory and safeguard standards in nuclear. And that's just not the case today. The paradigm has shifted. China and Russia are kind of kicking our butts in building reactors and deploying them worldwide. And so in order to take advantage of a massive growth opportunity in world markets, it's really important that the United States have technologies that are being developed and ready to take advantage of that market and step in. It requires public-private partnerships and reestablishing global nuclear leadership in the US. So that the three questions that I'm not going to touch now are just kind of what are we doing now on that front, on advanced nuclear? What does an evolving market look like in terms of how you price electrons? And what are the next steps in advanced nuclear policy? Thanks.
Thank you. Kathleen?
Thank you, Donna, for hosting us here, and good morning, everyone. To join in the welcome that Bob gave, welcome to Washington for those of you who are from out of town. PEPCO is one of the Exelon family of companies. We have 6 utilities across 5 states. We serve 10 million distribution customers, electricity and gas across the Mid-Atlantic. And we're also the largest, one of the largest generators of electricity. We operate every technology except for coal plants. We are the nation's largest operator of nuclear power. We have 23 operating reactors, so that's why I'm at this table. As you saw from my bio, though, I am a recovering federal regulator. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on at the federal regulatory level that affects the question we're here to discuss. And I have 3 things in mind that I'd like to talk about. And interestingly, the first one is not an initiative that would try to solve the problem that we've been discussing. It would actually try to reverse the effects of what the states have done. And you know, on behalf of Exelon, we have been very active in the state proceedings that you heard about on the last panel. I think it is important to note, and I think Ralph mentioned this, how bipartisan those efforts have been. Just to give you an example, the bill that just passed in New Jersey, the Assembly is made up of 80 members, 41 votes needed to pass. The very popular and aggressive RPS bill that was before the legislature received 50 votes. The nuclear bill received 60 votes, and it was a majority of Democrats, it was a majority of Republicans. There were folks who were up for tight races whose votes were not needed. They still voted for the bill. It made sense to the state from an environmental and economic perspective, and it reflects the will of the elected officials. But what's going on at the federal level right now is an open proceeding at the FERC to essentially reverse the effects of those state programs, and to say that what we should have instead is a market that doesn't reflect the effect of the state preference to have cleaner generators running more frequently and the air be cleaner for citizens. Instead, we're going to re-engineer the market so that the outcome is that we would see the price that we would otherwise see without the effect of those state programs, which is, of course, a higher price. And we would have plants running, more importantly, that wouldn't run because they are going to take the place of the clean generators that, according to one of the proposals that's on file at FERC, would be kicked out of the market. And so instead, the market would procure the next unit, which is an emitting resource. So we'd have higher prices and more pollution as opposed to lower prices and less pollution. That is clearly something that we don't think should happen. And that's the end of my remarks on topic 1. So if that's one thing that we don't want to see happen, what do we want to see happen at the federal level? And there is very, very exciting work underway in the New York ISO to look at the problem in front of the federal regulators in a different way and say, instead of trying to reverse the effects of state policy, how about if we try to achieve it through the market? The markets have done a tremendous job at incentivizing cost-effective and innovative solutions to getting the cheapest power on the grid when customers need it, and not having customers bear cost of choices that regulators or legislators might make. The market is sending a signal with the price, and then the developers respond and bring to the market the most cost-effective options. That has produced lower prices. It has produced great value for customers, but it has not internalized the cost of pollution. So what New York ISO is doing is saying, how about if we try to figure out, together with our state colleagues, a way to internalize that cost into the market and then let the market solve for the cheapest way to achieve both reliability, low cost power, and environmental performance at the same time. So, when Ralph Izzo spoke early this morning, he talked about the willingness of the federal regulators to take the environmental performance of the fleet into account. And should we expect to see FERC commissioners by themselves choose a price on carbon and internalize it into the market? And his view and my view is that we should not expect to see that. But what he also said was, to the extent the states want to work together with the market operators and FERC, then perhaps we may see that. And that's exactly what's happening in New York. The State Commission and the state government and the New York ISO are working together on a joint proposal, which they've just released, that would allocate responsibility to the state to choose the level of the price on carbon, and then the market to internalize that into the dispatch by having emitting generators factor the whatever subset of that cost of carbon times their emissions rate into their bids, and then the bid stack is reset. Emitting generators that can do so more cheaply would get picked ahead of emitting generators that can't do so, depending on their efficiency. And clean generators would see the benefit of not bringing of producing energy without pollution. And that would be a way to treat all resources in a fuel neutral way and let customers see the benefit of both keeping, the assets that can generate without less pollution that are in the system now, but also a signal to new generators of types we may not even realize now that could, through this market signal, bring new types of clean generation into the market. The last point relates to another open proceeding. But to close out on the New York proposal, it's working its way through the stakeholder process at the ISO, and with the goal of ultimately bringing that to the Commission. FERC would have to approve that, and that process is underway, not yet active here in DC. The last item, though, is active in DC, and it's a proceeding that FERC opened in January to address resilience, which is another way of explaining the issue that Ralph Izzo mentioned associated with what happens if we have an overdependence on any particular kind of fuel source, and then we have an interruption in that fuel source. What does that mean for customers and their ability to continue receiving the electricity that they need? And what we've seen is the New England ISO released a report looking forward into the future 4 or 5 years and saying, well, what happens if I lose that particular nuclear station or that particular piece of infrastructure? Will I be able to, and running a bunch of scenarios around that is a function of load and other conditions on the system, will I be able to keep the lights on? And in 19 out of 23 scenarios, they said they couldn't do that if they lost the pieces of infrastructure that I mentioned earlier. So we have recently seen PJM, the Mid-Atlantic operator, announce that they are planning to run a similar study to look forward and see if they too become too overdependent on a particular type of resource, would they see a similar outcome? And of course, as an operator in this region, and a company that delivers energy to 10 million customers, we're very supportive of that. But one thing that we want to make sure that we do when we do these studies is to measure the emissions impact of the planning choices that we make. What happened in New England this winter when they lost the ability to rely on natural gas supply for the amount of power that they needed to keep the lights on, they burned 2 million barrels of oil in 13 days, which is double what they had burned the whole year prior. So if we're going to talk about planning in the Mid-Atlantic, we shouldn't be planning for a system where we're planning to be overdependent or to increase our emissions as a result of losing resources. We should be planning for a system where we're going to continue to see decreases in emissions, and we believe that's a very important part of doing that evaluation here in the Mid-Atlantic. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you. I was asked to look a little further into the future to get beyond the art of what is currently possible and think about what might be possible in the future in terms of a federal policy, what the different policy structures are, how they might be better than the policies we're pursuing right now, and why that is the case. The state programs that we've been discussing mostly here, the ZEC type programs, they're not the best approach economically to preserve nuclear plants or to reduce carbon. They're not the second best, they might be the fourth best approach. They are possible now, they can be implemented in the near term, and so I think it's a good idea to do that because shutting down a nuclear plant is irreversible, and it is becoming imminent for a number of additional nuclear units beyond the 6 that have shut down in the last 5 years or so. So I want to touch on a couple of different broad types of policies and trade off the advantages and disadvantages of those. One is a carbon tax, sort of federal level carbon tax. If you don't like the word tax, you can call it a fee, but it's the same thing. The next is cap and trade. We're probably more familiar with cap and trade systems. There are some in place, not nationally in the US, but around the world and at regional levels in the US. Another possibility is a national clean energy standard, sort of like the state level renewable portfolio standards that we see now, but expanded to include all clean technologies and applied at the national level. So from an economic perspective, there's a lot of value to using a market mechanism to reduce carbon or achieve whatever goal it is that you want to achieve. It's efficient. Markets pursue efficiency for the thing that you ask them to pursue. So if you want a market solution, it is very helpful to be able to put a price on the thing that you want to get rid of, put a price on carbon. But just putting a price on carbon isn't enough. It has to be a material price, it has to be big enough to matter. It should be uniform so that a ton of carbon is deterred equally from any potential source. And it is very helpful if it is stable and certain, predictable over time. Across geography, so across different states, regions in the country, across sectors, not only the power sector, but also the transportation, buildings, and other sectors, across generation technologies within the power sector, and also across time. On those dimensions, carbon tax or fee approach performs quite well. It can be applied across sectors. It prices carbon. It can be nationwide. It can provide a uniform price, and it can be stable. It's one of the big advantages. A cap and trade program, we've seen some of those, has some of the same advantages as a carbon price, a carbon tax, in that it can be national, it can apply across sectors. But it doesn't necessarily, and it does create a carbon price, but it doesn't necessarily give a stable carbon price, and it's not a certain carbon price. And that's important because in order to reduce CO2 in the long term, a lot of investment is needed. Investment to keep existing nuclear plants running, investment to install new clean technologies. Investors are much more likely to invest if they know what their return is going to be. And if you're wondering whether the cap and trade program is going to create a $3 price on carbon or a $30 price on carbon, that doesn't give you the confidence you need to invest. The cap and trade programs also lead to attempts to solve these problems by putting a ceiling or a floor on the price, by having bankable allowances, reserve allowances, sometimes by adjusting the cap over time in order to get the price to where you want it to be. The third type of potential program, clean energy standard, I think is economically sort of the least preferred among these. First, it is difficult to apply it across sectors. It certainly could be national, geographically uniform, but it's difficult to apply it across sectors. It doesn't put a price on carbon. So you miss out on a lot of potential efficiencies. If you don't put a price on carbon, you don't even get the short-term dispatch, right? What plants you're running today? Are you running gas plants or coal plants? You don't get that question right if you don't have a price on carbon. And so I think that the clean energy standard is sort of economically, it's maybe third choice among these types of approaches. But unfortunately, the political preference seems to be almost exactly reversed from the economic properties of these general approaches. So I think I should probably just stop there since we're about out of time and open it to questions.
Let me start with a question. So we've talked about a number of different solutions here. I didn't hear any of you mention power purchase agreements as sort of direct approach, and I think that's one of the things raised in the policy paper that C2ES is releasing. Any reactions? I mean, it's a type of a market response. We've certainly seen Large companies that procured large amounts of renewables have helped move that market through power purchase agreements. On the other hand, if they're mandated, that may not be quite ideal. Any reactions to that potential solution? Kathleen?
Well, obviously, Sue talked about that on the last panel, that being what Connecticut sort of has used for its clean energy programs generally. So expanding that to include nuclear, a logical next step there. The question, anywhere where there isn't a mandate is on what basis is a company going to be authorized to execute a contract like that. If they're in a traditionally regulated market, they're going to need the approval of their state regulator to execute a contract that is going to pay additional amounts for the clean attribute from nuclear. You're not going to see that without having a legislative or regulatory support mechanism. The paper, I think, raises the idea of having power purchase agreements at the federal level. That is an option that would need to receive some amount of regulatory or legislative support at the federal level. Perhaps Ben can talk about the prospects of that. But again, the reason that we've had the influx of clean generation over the last 25 years is because government, on behalf of the people, has supported it. And the question is, on the PPA question, like any of these others, do we have, a government support to encourage it to happen?
Does anyone else want to comment on the PPA? And then I'd like to pick up on Kathleen's point about what's politically feasible.
I'll just say briefly that I think it can be a good solution in individual instances. It's more difficult to apply it broadly. It's sort of like the state ZEC programs. If that's what you can do in the short term to prevent the retirement of a plant that you don't want to see disappear entirely forever, it might be a good approach. But in terms of the economics of long-term policy, there are probably better options.
And the only thing I would say on this is that from the federal purchasing perspective, if it was a federal PPA, there are a couple of laws that are important to consider at this point. So in 1949, a law was passed that essentially dictates how federal purchasing is done, and that predates commercial nuclear power, predates renewables, predates quite a few things that are out there today. Today's natural gas plants didn't exist, nor did today's coal plants. And the law states that the maximum contract term for a purchase for power from a public utility is 10 years. The Department of Defense has a separate exemption, and they're allowed to purchase for up to 25 years. That has been exercised, the 25-year term, I believe, has been exercised by the Department of Defense in the previous administration for purchasing renewable power. And there are, any choice that the federal government would make, if it was an executive choice to purchase power, would have Congress overseeing that in some capacity. And so making a decision to buy power from a specific source would have to have some justification for it. And if you're purchasing renewable power as a Department of Defense, because the administration wants to buy clean electrons, that is one type of justification. Another justification may be for reliable or resilient power for national security purposes for a given asset of the federal government. And so that's a different question. So anyways, there are a lot of considerations in that piece, and some have posed a question that federal government may want to get into a PPA for first-of-a-kind types of power purchase agreements for small modular reactors or advanced reactors. That's a possibility. But these are all, this is sort of context of a theoretical discussion around this. But large PPAs, I don't know that Congress has ever really considered large PPAs for large light water power plants from the federal government.
So what is politically feasible here? What do you think we have an appetite to do? We've talked a little bit about some of the concerns about whether FERC has authority to act on its own. We've certainly talked about the possibilities of ISOs and RTOs coming forth with their own proposals, market-based, working better perhaps in states like New York, where you have an overlap between the state and the RTO boundaries. But we have ratepayer interests here, we have commercial interests, we have just what is jobs. Jobs are always important no matter where you are. So what do you think we can do?
I'm looking to Ben.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the bounds are of what we can do, but I could hit on a couple things that we are doing, maybe.
Okay.
Could fit in that category. So I mentioned this earlier, but how do you price electrons? So I think one thing that we have to recognize is that industry and the federal government are moving technologies forward in a rapid pace. So there are a lot of things today that are under development that will be on the grid in 10 years. We don't know exactly what the future of the grid will look like, but there are lots of projections with varying bounds about how many electric vehicles will be adopted, how much energy storage will be adopted, et cetera. The market rules certainly play a large part in how that adoption will happen. One of the difficult things is to figure out and guess what prices will be for value streams. Pricing clean electrons is one consideration. FERC has this docket open on the resiliency question. But one of the hard things to do is to guess how the market will price those value streams. So actually, the Department of Energy has a lot of important work going on right now in what we call hybrid energy systems. It's something that's sort of near and dear to Senator Murkowski's heart. She's an Alaskan, and she has a viewpoint of an Alaskan on energy. There are over 200 communities in Alaska that operate microgrids, and those are mostly reliant on diesel power. Their price point creates a question that goes kind of beyond that posed earlier by Mr. Izzo about how you make a choice between heating a home and buying electricity when natural gas supplies are tight. In those communities, mostly reliant on diesel power, the average price of electricity varies between 5 times the average rate of electricity in the US and 10 times. So that is a very difficult choice that Alaskans have to make. And the fuel supply is at risk, and there's a lot of emissions per capita associated with burning diesel. So Alaskans have become very innovative, and they've brought to bear locally available renewable sources, whether it be wind, solar, or small hydro, in creating hybrid systems that provide reliable and resilient power, because you can't have the lights go off or your grid go down when it's -40. And so that work has been seen by DOE. They're working together in a collaborative way, and DOE is trying to figure out how you may try to qualify and or quantify the types of value streams that different generation sources could produce when brought to bear on solving the grid problem. So if you were going to talk about creating hydrogen for a purpose in the future grid, or how electric vehicles may play in the grid, understanding the technical qualifications around those value streams is important, so that down the road the market can figure out how to price those. And ultimately the market, I think, will figure that out. But that technical leading work is very important, and it leads to the question of how nuclear will fit into that sort of advanced energy future.
Yeah, you're raising the point that we are here moving it. We're trying to tackle a problem that is moving, because as we see electric vehicles coming onto the grid, our load shape may be changing, the demand may be changing, we have new technologies coming on, all of those things mixing together. I would like to turn to Kathleen for a minute and talk again about the resiliency docket, how you see these intersecting, and what impact the results of that docket might have on this problem.
Sure. The experience I had when I was in the federal government with FERC is that it's a very fact and law-based organization. So I think the order that was issued in January, asking the RTOs for the answers to questions and asking for the public to come in and give them data was typical of how these things go at the commission. They're going to want to have evaluations done of, what are we talking about here? What does resilience mean when we're talking about the generation supply? We have a good handle on what we mean by resilience when we're talking about the distribution system or the transmission system, but what does it mean on the supply side? And what should FERC know, and what should the RTOs do about the security of the fuel supply behind the power plants? So this notion of fuel security is front and center with the commissioners, and the filings that came in from the RTOs and the filings that will come in from the rest of us, which are due today, will give them a sense of where they might go with it. I do think that it is a point of urgency for the commissioners. I've heard the chairman talk about how important this is to him, and in particular the issue of when we talk about resilience, we need to do the math, we need to understand what's behind the studies that the RTOs are running, what's the role of the rest of the federal government in informing those studies. There are threats, both natural and man-made, to the power system that we read about in the newspapers, but that government has more information about than the market operators and the market participants. And how can we get that information into the hands of people who are doing these studies and running the scenarios about what the future grid will look like if there is an interruption to one of our fuel supply sources. And then, once we do that work, how can we think about reforming the market so that we can, again, this has been a theme today, use the market to solve for the concern that we have in the most cost-effective way possible. So obviously there's a lot of work that I think needs to go into doing that evaluation, and I would expect the Commission to be deliberate, as it always is, about reviewing the filings and then charting out a path forward that they can defend both to their constituents, to the American citizens that rely on them, and then in court when whatever they do ultimately makes its way there. So I don't have a direct answer as to what to expect other than thoughtful, deliberate work, a little bit faster than you typically see from the Commission, because I do think it's a priority for them, and then a thoughtful response.
I'd like to now open it up to questions, both from the audience and to the extent any of our panelists have questions for each other. That's fair game, too. Yes, over here. There's a mic coming your way.
Cindy Wilson from Department of Energy. This is primarily based on Donna's comment, or Kathleen's comments. You talk about New York being a model of looking at a different way for valuing what you really want in your grid and getting it. My question has to do with states in the two RTOs where they've pretty much sacrificed state authority, the regulation of distribution systems. How do you transfer that New York model to ISO New England and PJM, where the state's power is very, very different?
Well, let me just answer the question this way. The three Northeast RTOs are no different in the sense of what they have given up and what they have kept. All the states throughout all those markets have the authority under the Federal Power Act over the generation of electricity. That is something Congress wrote in 1935. That has not changed. So while it is true that they use the markets to centrally dispatch the power plants in their footprints, and they have in all of those markets a capacity market where they have forward planning in terms of which units they're going to have available on the system to provide that energy. The states still have authority over the generation of electricity in their footprints. It is simpler for the New York ISO, as Donna said, to work together with their state on a way to price carbon into the market because they're only dealing with one state. And so it is, as you suggest, more difficult in a state, in an RTO where there's multiple states that need to all come together and agree, for example, on a carbon price, or if they even want to impose a carbon price to the market. And that's, I think, the challenge that we saw play out over the last 18 months. The New England states did work together on an effort to see if there were different ways, different from what New York came up with, but similar in concept, to try to use the market in New England to achieve their goals. And I think that work will continue in New England. What PJM is facing is, of course, even more than the 6 states in New England. They're facing 14 different jurisdictions. And what they've said is that to the extent the states come together and want us to reflect a price on carbon through the market, we will find a way to hold the states that are not interested in that sort of separate. And so they could have a region within PJM where the states that would prefer to have carbon price to the market reflect that in the bids of their generators, but it wouldn't show up in the bids of generators that are outside the carbon region. PJM has released a white paper explaining how they would do that. It's so-called border adjustment type of mechanism. So again, what we're doing here in this discussion is talking about what states have done already. And if you asked someone in the end of 2015 whether they thought any of this stuff would have happened, they would have said it was not politically feasible, it wouldn't happen. And as we've seen, it's been popular, in fact, as I described in terms of the New Jersey outcome, among people who have listened to Dean and his colleagues who've done the work to explain what the benefits are, why this is such a low-cost option for cleaning the air. And so what's politically feasible in the future, whether we could get, as you suggest, the states in New England or the states in PJM to agree on a process going forward, I'm optimistic because I like to think that, again, people will continue listening to Dean and say, if we want to have good outcomes for customers, we should harness this creation that we've come up with here in Washington, the wholesale markets, and we should use them to get good outcomes for the people that depend on us.
Thank you. Do we have time for another question? Okay.
I think Dean may want to jump in on that.
Oh, Dean,
I'll just
please.
follow up on that, one brief comment. It's not the case that PJM is not putting a price on carbon. PJM is putting a price on carbon. It's zero. 75% of the load in PJM comes from states that have established an RPS. And presumably they established that RPS because they value clean energy and the lack of carbon emissions. So it's important to keep in mind that PJM isn't just saying we're not taking a position on carbon. They're very much taking a position on carbon, but they're taking a position that it's priced at zero.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Well, let me wrap up with one more here, which is the question about sort of national uniformity. If we have some RTOs, perhaps, moving forward, we know RTOs don't cover the entire country. If we talk about a clean energy standard, it's going to impact different parts of the country differently, simply because they have different resources. We can talk about PPAs, but again, it's a kind of one-off solution. Is there anything other than a carbon tax that has a national impact? And would that, in fact, even have a national impact that would affect ratepayers more or less evenly across the country?
Certainly there are a number of approaches that could be applied nationally. Clean energy standard could be applied nationally and might be quite effective. Certainly we've seen renewable portfolio standards in the states have encouraged the addition of large amounts of renewable energy, large relative to where it started. Not large yet relative to where nuclear is at the moment, and has been for a while. But you could certainly expect that to have an effect. I'm not sure it would be as economically efficient, which means it would cost more. To get the same amount of carbon reductions, it would cost more through a clean energy standard. And there are ways to turn a clean energy standard into something that more or less approximates a carbon price by giving partial credit for less polluting sources. That is still an approximation, nonetheless. It still doesn't get the short-term dispatch question right of, do I run a gas plant or do I run a coal plant? If I price carbon at zero for both of them, I get a different answer than if I actually had a carbon price.
Ben?
I would just say that almost anything we do at the federal level that either incentivizes or disincentivizes a technology really has a national effect, but it trickles down into the various states based upon what their generation resource capability is, right? So our choice is to subsidize anything at the federal level through PTCs, ITCs, MLPs, or other various tax mechanisms do have a national effect and also a regional or local effect. And the other sort of caveat is the same is true for anything we invest in as far as energy R&D goes. So the money that is put into technology development and the policies that are put in place to allow public-private partnerships to move technologies to market quicker change the price curves of those technologies, which ultimately, because we have various types of markets around the US, leads towards technology development that brings those technologies to market where they sort of make sense based on the market rules. So I mean, it's interesting, but I think anything that FERC does at a federal level does have a sort of federal effect and state or local effect. The same thing with anything DOE chooses to put money into research into, and the same thing that our colleagues on the tax committee deal with.
Okay, thank you. Any last comments from our panelists? Something you haven't had a chance to say you want to say? Okay, well, I think with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Bob to wrap us up and send us off. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, well, I think we're going to end this here because I know that it's past due for lunchtime. Well, first of all, I want to thank GW and the law school for letting us use this. Donna, this is always a great space, nice spot for the audience, comfortable. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your participation. This is a great panel, and as was the other panel. And we've had some of the national experts in this vexing issue of maximizing zero-emission electricity in the United States, from people working on it at the state level, people thinking about it at the federal level, congressional, people that run companies trying to figure out how to make these things work. It's a daunting but very important thing that we pursue. We're happy at C2ES that we're, as an independent think tank, we can acknowledge our present reality as we try to look at how we tackle carbon pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. We have the solutions. We have things in our hands now that can help us do this. Everything from, and Ralph talked about some of this even in his talk, everything from fuel-efficient cars, electric vehicles, better smart buildings and energy efficiency, cities and states, and we didn't talk a lot about cities today on the renewable and the efficiency side, but certainly states and markets are emerging in some states now, from California to the Northeast. California's even linked up to Canada. We need clean energy, and that means we have to stop this choosing problem we have. And if anything brought that home today was the experience that's going on in Arizona, where they have in their grasp an ability to be virtually 100% clean energy, yet they continue to lock horns over what's the best way to do it, when in fact the best way to do it is probably right in front of them. So we're hoping that this will help further that debate in a rational and calm way, and that we can find a way to move a little bit further down the road with getting renewable energy and other zero-emitting sources and nuclear energy working together to solve this problem. We are also pleased with the fact that the Paul Allen Family Fund has also been helping us in our research on these matters, and we look forward to that continued work with the panelists and with other people. So thank you all for hanging in. All of you that have been watching live stream, thank you for multitasking. And for the rest of you, have a great day.